Good evening, and welcome to a community conversation of the Lorentzsen Center for Faith and Work, a program of the Offutt School of Business at Concordia College. My name is Per Anderson, Interim Director of the Center. Established 8 years ago, the Center honors the work of Norman Lorentzsen, Concordia graduate, CEO of Burlington Northern Railway, Regent of the College, and generous philanthropist. The center seeks to integrate faith and work in support of the vision of the Offutt School to serve society through ethical leaders who are confident, curious, and globally competent. I am delighted this evening to welcome Miroslav Volf to this conversation. Professor Volf is Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School and founding director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, dedicated to a world in which every person can wrestle with life's most important questions and take hold of a life worthy of our humanity. Tonight, we are privileged to engage an award-winning author of more than 20 books, a globally active teacher, a visionary leader on the critical questions of Christian theology today. And I might add, a person who commits great time and energy to the public witness of the church and to public dialogue about faith and life. A full account of Professor Volf's extensive achievements and involvements can be found online, as well as his excellent podcast series, For the Life of the World. Welcome, Professor Volf. So glad you can join us tonight.
I'm delighted.
We gather this evening for the final conversation of our series on good work and its future toward respect, engagement, and meaning. From the beginning, we have noted that good work eludes many people today. Only 1/3 of Americans report being engaged with their work. 1/3 report active disengagement. Guided by the social teaching of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we have examined workplace realities that rightly cause many Americans to withhold investment in their work. Safety threats for essential occupations, racism in the workplace, the stresses of independent gig employment, the threat of being automated. These realities, when seen through the lens of ELCA social policy, raise questions whether our society exercises sufficient respect for large portions of the American workforce. Problems of workplace safety, employment opportunity, fair remuneration, democratic participation, and more need urgent address, as does the increasing assumption of risk and growing vulnerability of many workers. Automation will bring new productivity to address challenges such as an aging workforce and food supplies imperiled by climate change. But we will also see disruption and loss that likely finds many Americans unprepared. If good work eludes many Americans today, what about the future? Can the future of work be better? Do humans have power as groups and as individuals to change, to transform the worlds we inhabit and the lives we lead, including work? If so, how? Having looked now at disrespect and disengagement at work, we turn this evening to the possibility of engaging work, transformative work, born of ultimate concerns and convictions that confer meaning to life and to work. When work has meaning, it matters. It matters to workers. It matters to others who share or respect this meaning. When work has ultimate significance and purpose, good things can happen for all involved. We turn now to a conversation with Professor Volf about work and meaning and what Christianity has to say. I invite our audience to submit questions through the Q&A function. Good evening again, Miroslav.
Good evening.
You have been thinking about work for a long time. When did you first engage this topic and why?
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't say when. I mean, how long ago? But I think I was in the search of a dissertation topic, and I wanted to do something that was close to people's lives. And I'd realized that, at least in the circles where I was, not much has been done theologically about work. And then I was looking for a particular angle and decided to study Karl Marx. Partly because I lived at that time in a communist country, which was ruled by communist ideology, and Marx was very prominent, but partly also because Karl Marx is probably the most influential philosopher who has devoted most of his life studying the question of human work, influential both at the intellectual level, but influential also in that his ideas have become probably in botched form and malformed political realities in many parts of the world. And so that's how I came to study work. And first 10 years of my career were spent dealing with questions of work in various ways.
Good. I think it's important that Marx deserves credit for putting work on the agenda of Christian theology. I agree. So today, your interest in work aligns with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, which has this bold vision statement, a world in which every person can wrestle with life's most important questions and take hold of a life worthy of our humanity. Um, Life worthy of our humanity is a way of talking about the good life, as you say, which you call, and we'll talk about tonight, as flourishing life. And in your latest book, For the Life of the World, you write at one point, truly flourishing life is the most important concern of our lives. And yet you also say that this question is systematically marginalized today. Can you say a little bit about the public conversation that you're seeking to encourage here about life worthy of our humanity?
Yeah, and that line, life worthy of our humanity, can be, as you've indicated earlier, can be expressed in many different ways. Truly flourishing life, or in the biblical text, you can say abundant life, or you can say life that truly is life, which is a quote from one of the pastoral letters. In varieties of ways, this has been a central motivating issue for the Christian faith, also, by the way, for great religious traditions of the world and also of great philosophies. But in the few last decades, I would say 70s on in particular, this question has been progressively marginalized from the broader culture as well as from the higher education. The idea was that each of us is an expert on what true life is for each one of us. There is no such a thing as a common public good to which we all can strive, and therefore it has been thrown back to individuals to explore this as a matter of preference. And I think something really profound is lost when we don't nurture intelligent conversation about this issue. I'll give you one example. I started a class at Yale together with a colleague of mine on called Life Worth Living. And one of our first cohort of folks was a young woman from India. She was 17 or so. I mean, she came brilliant. And at the end, we asked, what were their impressions of this course? And we studied great tradition, including Christianity, what they say about what is truly flourishing life, and did that as a declaration of the truth of the matter rather than simply what people felt was interesting for them or what they said to them. And she, in response, said, I never had a permission to engage with intellectual seriousness this question. And I said, my goodness, this was what motivated a great deal of philosophy and religion. And she now is in a situation where she has to ask for intellectual permission to engage it with intellectual vigor. And I realized that this is the real problem that we are
Right.
facing. We need to address it in our broader culture, but
Right.
also in our educational institutions.
Great. Yeah, and I refer our audience to your new book if they really want to see your case for why you think this is a universal, fundamental question that we all share as humans. But that's the premise of this project, which is very, very exciting. So we're going to turn now to kind of the state of work in anticipation of hearing your theology of work. You kind of look at the big picture as you see it, as economies change from agricultural to industrial to informational to service, global. Work changes. So work has changed a lot. Work is changing dramatically in the future. When you do Christian theology, what are the characteristics of modern work that really draw your attention, that need to be engaged, that are long-term and that are consequential in our lives?
Somehow for me, um, kinds of issues that have motivated reflection about work for centuries remain still very highly relevant. For instance, I think, and most people consider work to be a means to a particular end. Hopefully, as I will say, maybe more, not only a means to something, but certainly it's an instrumental activity. And my question was always a very simple one. And that is the way in which we engage in work, means as it is, worthy of our humanity? How we spend work time working, is this an expression of a flourishing life? Or are we in working kind of alienated from ourselves?
Yeah.
We are outside of the domain of our proper humanity. We parked our humanity aside and we work simply as a means to an end. And my sense is the more the work becomes a part of our expression of our humanity, the more humanity is going to be. And today it's difficult to achieve that because the work is not so much under our control in various ways. For many years now in industrial societies, the work pacing and character of work has been controlled all the way from taylorization to the way in which work is being done in contemporary societies, some of which you mentioned in your introduction. And then in the second thing is, as instrumental activity, work also aims at a certain goal. We pursue work in order to achieve certain goals. And then the question is, well, what are these goals? Are these goals of work worthy of our humanity? For most of us, I think, it turns out what we want as a goal of our work is a paycheck at the end. And if that's what it is, there's something deficient about this. I mean, there's something honorable about this. I don't want to simply dismiss that as an aspect of work, but if it's reduced to that, it seems to me that something is deficient. In work, we create the world. In a sense, in work, to use a biblical imagery, we cooperate with God. I mean, early on in first books of Genesis, you had this sense that work is a cooperation with God in the work, in the life of the creation. Now, my question is, where is that in the work as we experience it today? How do we retrieve that? In other words,
Okay.
how do we come back to ourselves as workers?
Let me quote from the book about this matter, because you make some striking statements about how work functions in this mainstream culture, in this dominant culture. So this is from the section where you're talking about living the dream, and you say, though silent about the nature of the good life, modern cultures are very clear, even strident, about the preconditions for the life each of us considers to be good. Secure the resources you might need for living your dream, whatever that might be. Hartmut Rosa calls this the overruling rational imperative of modernity. And then you say, in the course of modernity, we have made it our chief goal and the main purpose of our major institutions, the state, the market, science and technology, education, and even religion, to secure the resources we think we need to live the life we want. The task of securing resources keeps us busy. We work more today than we have ever before. Work is not all we do, of course. We enjoy the pleasures of life. For many, these pleasures are the purpose of work and of life itself. And then you go on later to talk about what you call the deadening effect of the work fun loop that we don't know how to escape. Is this the dominant construct of work, the meaning of work?
Well, it seems to be prevalent, and I think it's partly a function of what early on Max Weber has observed in his Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, where he speaks about how in the modern societies there is a kind of there is a decoupling of work from human purposes and orientation of work and of entire economic activity around the end of profit. So it's not the certain human goals that are being achieved, or they're being achieved via increase of the profit, but this profitability dominates economic activity. And when profitability dominates economic activity, sometimes it's very hard to structure the work according to human measure. It will be
Yeah.
structured according to the most efficient output and most
Mhm.
efficient outcome of that work. And then you end up in this situation where work cannot give you a much meaning, and then you work in order to acquire resources that you then spend in whatever ways, and normally you end up being too tired to do much else, and to so you either devote your time to another acquiring another resource that may be reputational resource, that may be aesthetic wisdom, that may be uh, any other kind of resource, bragging rights for this or that. But it's either resources, monetary or otherwise, or some kind of fun. But the really deeper questions of life, what it means to be a human being, escape us. Indeed, when we ask sometimes people, they don't even know what that might be.
Okay, good, good. We will get to that in a moment, and when we start to unpack your own theology. Um, you commented back in the book on Work in the Spirit, which came out in early 90s, about some crises of work. You talked at that time about child labor, unemployment, discrimination, dehumanization, exploitation, ecological crisis. Are there other items that you would like to add or take off that list when you again think about we've talked about an existential crisis, a religious crisis, a crisis of meaning in terms of the condition of labor? Do you see much change in the last couple of decades?
I think what I see in change is some of the things that you have mentioned at the very beginning, which is a kind of increase, not loss of meaning of which we were talking earlier, but kind of uncertainty that is associated about work. Everybody is, so to speak, thrown on their own resources, and this being thrown on oneself in an economy that doesn't operate on the basis of vocation or stable work over a period of years. Gig
Yeah,
economy, a very good example of that.
yeah,
It increases a great deal of uncertainty and there are no networks that can catch people. And my sense is that that creates, uh, for some people, I'm sure it creates opportunities, but in the end, it creates so many risks for people, and I'm afraid of a kind of sense of work contributing to a larger sense of myself as a human being, that being
right,
lost, and I myself being uncertain what's going to come of me once I face retirement, for instance.
right, right. So there are people writing about the age of precarity and the precarity, and that's I think what you're saying, and I think that's very powerful.
Yeah.
When we get inside,
There's kind of chosen precarity of his 30 days book, right? Which is to participate in this kind of experience. Many saints have done so, but this is imposed precarity of
right,
life, and
right,
that's what we
right,
need. Yeah.
right. When we start to get into your theology, we'll understand that the idea of the future is absolutely critical. So I think we have to ask you as well how you see the future of labor, how you see automation, things like that. As you know, the future of work is, there are volumes upon volumes of this right now. We're focused on this in higher education.
Yes.
What's your sense of the future? Is it more of the same, or do you really see some transformations because of automation or globalization? Maybe you have thoughts about what will happen on the other side of the pandemic.
Yeah. So my concerns are about progressive de-skilling or progressive de-skilling that was a feature of technological development. Um, and it's a one thing for you to have a tool and then acquire skills to use the tool. And it's another thing if the machine or the tool takes over entire domains of activities and then reduces your competencies. So part of it was experienced in the kind of systems of the world, division of social and economic worlds, division of labor, which contributed to this skilling, and part of it is the consequence of tools. Then the question becomes, except for a few very highly skilled, what happens with the rest of the people? What kind of work is available to them in order to fulfill their humanity? When we know that pretty soon, for instance, let's take the work of a translator, which seems a highly skilled work requiring a knowledge of the language and experience and so forth. It can be replaced fairly easily in the foreseeable future with artificial intelligence. And that applies to the work of any person, whether it's journalists. Um, although some of those compositions of IE right now are really sketchy and
Yeah.
not particularly high literary achievements, but nonetheless, it's coming. And I think that creates, to me, a significant problem where our domain activities shrinks, our skills shrink, and then becomes a question: what does work for us mean? What do activities for us mean? What do we do as human beings, especially if we don't reflect on what other things may come in place that of work which deepen our humanity? And obviously, we are not the first ones to think about it. Karl Marx, others have thought about what
Yep.
happens if the work week shrinks and we have too much, we have more time than we used to have.
Right. Right. I don't understand the literature as an expert, but we are following the debate about whether or not automation will take away, what we would classically call kind of drudgery and difficult sort of physical work, and then give us the opportunity to exercise our higher powers, creativity, teamwork, innovation, and that a whole new class of work will come into existence. There's a theorist named Jamie Marasotis that we're reading about the future of work in higher education that's very optimistic about where we can go, but it's I know the debates are
Yeah.
complex. Yeah.
I'm optimistic about where debates can go,
Yeah.
but where things can go, but whether they will go, that's where I'm less optimistic.
Okay, good. So let's turn now to the way you want to think theologically about work. And you do this in a very distinctive way. It's different than the Lutheran take on work that we'll get to in a minute. But walk us into your idea about how you see work as part of Christian life in the Holy Spirit, in anticipation of the new creation. In the Holy Spirit, new creation are big ideas that come out of your main work of 30 years ago.
Yeah. So, so my sense of my basic question in this book and for myself, a lot of things I reduced to basic question was this: if the entire life of a Christian is a life in the Spirit, that's what it means to be a Christian, right? To the beginning of Christian life, at the beginning of the church, is the Holy Spirit, and birth to a new life, and the entire life is led in the power of the Holy Spirit, as was Jesus's entire ministry as well. Now, if that's the case, then it must be also the case that the work that we do as part of that life is also work in the Spirit. That cannot be parked to the side. That means that in some way, a kind of vision that we have for our life more broadly as Christians has to inform the life that we lead as people who do this or that kind of work. And obviously, that builds on our status as creatures. And in our status as creatures, we need to work. Work contributes also creatively to the character of the world. But I think Christians find themselves in a situation of living toward the future of the new creation. Redemption isn't simply redemption from sin, but redemption into something that transcends the bounds of the creation, and that too then will have impact on the kind of work we do. And as you mentioned earlier, in my view, this orientation toward future is significant for the Christian faith, but I think it's significant also for us as human beings. We live in kind of extended present, but that extended present always anticipates a certain kind of a future. We place ourselves into the future. We try to realize that, and work plays a very important role in this anticipation of the future. That means also that we have to reflect deeply about where it is that we are going precisely by working in other ways as well, where we are going as a society, what kind of future are we creating, and where we as individuals are moving, in what direction we are as individuals are moving.
So how do you see humans participating in this transformation of the world? Are they agents? We have in Luther this idea of humans as the mask of God. We understand them participate in the creative activity of the world, preserving the world. The ELCA, our church, has a slogan, God's work, our hands, as a way of expressing this. But I think you have a different view on this. Could you explain?
Well, I could use the same kind of vocabulary, and I think it's a good vocabulary to use, namely that God works through us, or we cooperate with God in different ways. I think the question is whether we primarily orient our work around doctrine of creation, whether we are tools in God's hand to kind of maintain creation,
Right.
or are we tools in the hands of the Spirit of God who renews the creation in anticipation of the transformation that comes with the coming of Christ and future expectation that we have? And I have, since I emphasize this work in the Spirit, I have then always connected work not just with creation, but also with new creation. And of course, new creation cannot simply cross and disregard creation as it is, because the new creation comes about as creation out of nothing, new creation out of nothing, but it's creation out of old. And so on the creation itself, we work in anticipation of what is to come.
So does this have implications for your attitude, say, about technology, about human innovation, about intervention into the natural world, genetic alteration, those kind of things? Is that where this goes in terms of your openness to the Spirit working through the human creative process to advance
Yeah,
the
I
human
think
predicament?
that's right. I'm open to that, but also um, thinking about future invites discernment about what kind of future. That is to say, not any kind of future which we can design for ourselves, whether that is through genetic manipulation or whatever else that might be, is a desirable kind of future. Then the question of discernment comes in, and we can, but instead of simply um, closing ourselves to a wide variety of innovation, we exercise discerning judgment. Now, I will certainly not say that those who work within the framework of creation rather than new creation, as I do, cannot make discernment judgments. They do on slightly different basis. That is to say,
Right.
more there's orientation on preservation of creation, but it seems to me that doesn't take sufficiently into account kind of inherent dynamism of the work, inherent innovation in just about everything that we do. I also realize that maybe orienting work around new creation, especially in the time of ecological crisis, may have downsides to it. Maybe it can look too optimistic. And that's why I emphasized from the very beginning this kind of discerning judgment, so that by working we do not destroy, but we enhance. We move into a future that is richer rather than cutting our own possibilities of life by risks that we take with new technologies or something like this.
Okay. Because your theology is very interesting, because in one sense it gives Christians permission to participate in public life today, which is obviously oriented to innovation, culture, or technology, science, economic development. You open the world to Christians in that sense, but you also want them to live a life that is, as you say in another chapter, a proleptic life. You're already trying to live a life that anticipates the new creation and live differently in the world. Live with a different sense of direction. And there was a book that I read in graduate school by Alan Verhey called The Great Reversal, which was very eye-opening to me. He shows again and again throughout New Testament ethics how every ethical norm comes out of Jesus and the early church is tied to the idea of the kingdom, and in living in anticipatory relationship to the kingdom. And therefore that's why Christians live lives that are different, why they talk about things like loving the enemy.
Yeah, I'm very much along the same lines, and it's a kind of future orientation, but it's a particular kind of future. It's not any future goes.
Right.
It's a kingdom
Right.
of God kind of future,
Right.
and kind of non-violence of Christ, or for instance, you can say what Christ did, what you find in the Gospels, how the question of kingdom of God itself is treated. It's not rejected, it's taken up, but it is internally transformed. And I'm interested in this kind of internal transformation that can occur within certain inherited modes of behavior when they intersect with the promised future of God.
Okay. Could we talk a little bit about, say, your relationship to Luther, where you would agree with him
Yeah.
on vocation and where you would part company? We have many members in the audience who are Lutheran, and as you know, the Lilly Endowment was very significant in launching the idea of vocation into American higher education, particularly church-related colleges. There's a very robust conversation about vocation going on, but you don't really want to use that term. And so maybe you could help us understand that.
Well, I'm not opposed to using that term. I think in general, vocation, a language is a good language, and Luther distinguishes between two types of vocation, right? One is a general vocation, which is the vocation from the darkness into light, to use the metaphorical vocabulary. The other one is a specific type of vocation for particular callings in ministry, plural now that we have. And obviously, there's a connection between these two types of call, or at least I want to maintain the connection. Sometimes in the Lutheran tradition, the question was whether there is actually tight connection between one calling, which is the calling of the gospel, and other callings, what the relationship is. So I'm happy to talk in general about calling. I'm happy also to talk about element of calling in each one of our specific particular kinds of vocations. But it would seem to me that at least the inner logic of that term and way the Luther himself employed it was oriented towards stability, oriented toward a kind of single vocation over a period of time. What I was interested in is this dynamic character of particular vocations in biblical traditions, and that's expressed in charisms that each person has. We can have multiple charisms. You can have one charism today and tomorrow another one. So it's a much more dynamic picture, which seems to me better corresponds to the character of tasks that we have before us and to the character of the modern world. Let me just add one thing. which I think Luther was. I mean, I'm a great fan of Luther. Actually, most of my soteriology is great young Luther with a certain interpretation, but it's I think he's my hero with warts, but he's a hero. And I teach regularly a seminar on Luther at YDS. Now, I think in terms of vocation, Luther's discovery of the significance of ordinary life, that was a kind of fundamental achievement. It picked up on some of the developments that were there earlier, but nonetheless, he articulated it and gave it a kind of profile that was, I think, very significant. Way he treats Martha and Mary and relationship between the two.
Right.
I think it's really splendid. It's
Right.
extraordinary. So
Right.
that's that.
Right. The phrase that Charles Taylor coined for this, the affirmation of ordinary life, is fantastic. That really captures his innovation.
Yeah.
I think we have some questions now starting to come in. We can take a look at. Okay. It seems then we're gonna for your purposes, Miroslav, we're gonna start turning to the unpacking, I think, flourishing life now, and how this works in the daily life of work, and how it helps us to see meaning, how it helps us to bear some of the burdens of work that are still very much very real. So here's one question. It says, it seems then that for work to be flourishing, it must have a goal outside of ourselves, to somehow see it as serving the neighbor in love from our Christian perspective. Do you see it bigger than this?
That's a very good way to ask the question. I certainly see it as big as that. That is to say that work is a service. There's a kind of element of creating a good, and that creation of a good requires certain disciplines, a certain kind of arresting of my own desire, so that I can devote my energies to another person and to another broader cause. I would extend that to kind of creation, kind of social relations. When I speak about flourishing life, for me, the flourishing life has three dimensions. One dimension is that life is going well for me, that circumstances of life are such that if I were a plant and if I were planted in this kind of, I would be growing and flourishing. There's enough water, there's enough fresh air, all the circumstances are there that are conducive to the growth of a plant called Miroslav and pear. But that's a substantial aspect of the good life. There's also agency aspect, agential. I need to act in the right way. I'm not a plant. I'm a human being, and I have responsibility to act. And I have to act responsibly. And in work, obviously, I can act in service to others, creating a good work. And finally, I think there's an emotional dimension of good life, affective dimension of the good life. And that is a Christian tradition characterized by joy. And I think that's what I was gesturing toward earlier. I think I ought to be able to find joy in my work, as well as bring joy to others by working. And so these three dimensions of the good life, I would take as a grid almost and place on work that we do, and almost to check, okay, does it happen in circumstances? Does it create circumstances that are right? Check one. Does it exercise my agency in such a way that goods are being produced that are of benefit to others? Check two. Am I able to rejoice as doing it? And do I bring joy to others? Check three.
Right. Very good. Very nice. Okay, we have another question. In the discussion tonight about de-skilling and the future of automation as providing some sort of more fulfilling work, and life seems to ignore, okay, seems to ignore the work of people in the service and hospitality fields. The pandemic has exposed their high vulnerability. At the same time, there is some recognition of the necessity of work these workers do. What is the future of work for these people? How can the future of that work enhance human fulfillment for people in those kinds of work? So I think the question is searching for how we find these goods that you talk about of peace and joy and love within all of work today, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think this type of service work, especially in settings like pandemic, we all were certainly excited and thought very highly of workers of this sort. On my street, when I walk, I have all sorts of hearts hanging out of windows and signs in yards, and they were all in favor of kind of essential workers. But we need to also create structures in which that kind of work is valued, in which that kind of work is properly remunerated. And obviously, when you think about it, it is some of the most beautiful work that can be done, most humane kind of work that is being done. And yet, very often, these people are overworked, underpaid. We clearly do not terribly value, except when we need it, and even then, we're not able to properly honor it and take proper care even of our essential workers. And so all those hearts sometimes that I see, that they're more expression of our own need and uncertainty and fear than they are of willingness actually to show benevolence and the beneficence toward these people and truly honor them.
Thank you. So, Dr. Wolf, thank you for a stimulating conversation. I think you said our society or economy commodifies the value of work in a way that decouples it from a sense of human flourishing or that which gives life ultimate meaning. And at the end of the workday, we just fill up with the pursuit of more commodities, resources, for example, entertainment and aesthetic. So this means students come to Concordia not just uninformed about the greater questions of human flourishing and the role of work in it as co-creators with God, but discouraged from any sense of value apart from instrumental value. What would then be the role of liberal arts in reawakening a deeper sense of human flourishing and value, a necessary first step into a deeper sense of the meaning of work and vocation, of calling?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think that's partly what motivates this whole. I mean, teaching this course, Life Worth Living, was motivated by just that question, and we have a consortium, other universities that are taking up that type of course. They're teaching it elsewhere, partly because I think the central question that's being asked here, in some ways, is that if I ask, how do I succeed in work? That's a wrong way to pose the question. First question that I need to ask, what does it mean for me to succeed as a human being? What does it mean to succeed as a human? And once I have a sense of what that might mean, then I can, within that, find the place how success properly looks in work. I mean, that's the old question that I've briefly touched on when speaking about Luther, the relationship between uh, generic calling or one great calling for each individual to be member of the kingdom of God, to be member of the church, to whatever way you want to express that. And the other one is, what do I do with my particular life in a particular situation? And one has to inform the other. Otherwise, you have a tension between my humanity and what it consists in, and sometimes forgetfulness of that humanity, and what my work consists in.
What I hear coming through in several of your answers is, again, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, something we owe to Karl Marx of this idea, the experience of alienation from work that does not somehow is not fitted, as you would say, to our human nature,
Yeah.
and that we know that to be wrong. We know that to be the source of deep misery.
Yeah, I think that's his basic and fundamental insight. I might want to at some significant points also um, kind of tinker with his idea. And one of the very important areas where I would like to see where we are too Marxist, if you want, even in modern societies, is how we deal, for instance, with the question of rest.
Ah,
Um, so we have work and we have entertainment, but the concept of rest seems to have we have lost, except kind of to recuperate for exertion that we make in order to either have fun or to work, either to acquire resources or to enjoy whatever we want to enjoy. And what we end up losing is both the space in which we step back and evaluate our life as a whole, because that was a function of rest. Sunday, our Sabbath worship was partly oriented toward that. But in some ways, I think even more importantly, it's Sabbath was um, you arrest work and not simply to recuperate, but to arrest work to affirm the goodness of what is. First
yeah,
day in first Sabbath is which God celebrated after God created the world in seven days, and it starts. Behold, everything was very good, right? I
right.
think that's the purpose also of Sabbath. So kind of almost like a celebration of the goodness of what is. We know that there's plenty of things that we can repair and do better,
Mhm.
and we work in order to improve, right?
Right.
But the celebration of the goodness that is so fundamental to us.
Right.
I love this
Right.
story. I think Abraham Heschel does it, mentions it in his little book on Sabbath, which is kind of a beautiful book about it,
Right.
about this rabbi who on the Sabbath went to his yard, and then he was praising God in the yard, and then saw that his fence was torn, and immediately he started being worried about, oh, I need to repair that fence and so forth. And so he saw himself, his Sabbath joy was shifting into worry about what do I do with that fence. And then he told himself, this fence is going to remain unrepaired as a punishment for for taking my attention away. Those are my words. My attention away from the good to what isn't quite right. And I think we are terribly bad at celebrating the good.
Right. And I really appreciated that in your most recent book too, the way you then talk about worship within that context of Sabbath and of renewal. And again, it's a moment of intersection with a culture that's not averse to play, but it is not a kind of play that you want to affirm.
Or I mean, when I talk about this, I invoke the virtue, classical virtue of contentment. I think
Mhm.
today it has become a vice. Occasionally, I post things on Facebook and on Twitter. And once I made a post, basically, I'm not sure exactly what I said, something in praise of contentment. I have never gotten as much abuse on Facebook
Mm.
as I did
Wow.
when I praised
Uh,
contentment.
uh, yeah.
Not even when I made critical comments about this or that political decision or a great hero of whoever. And
Yeah.
the idea behind was if you emphasize contentment, you mean you're holding me back. You're telling me not to improve. I should just stay where I am. So the kind of
Mm.
dynamism that is there in contentment and work. 6 days you should work, but for God's sakes, one day just be contented. Be
Mhm.
celebrate of what is good, right? And I believe that unless one celebrates what is good, no matter what we do, we will always be chasing our own tail and will never be achieving anything. right? Because the goodness will escape us. Everything will always be never good enough, never enough money, never enough reputation, never enough anything. And then so I'm in a constant tizzy of activity that go nowhere. I'm like this squirrel in the wheel, and I'm running faster and faster to stay in the same place by doing that.
Good, good. I think we have another question. Pope John Paul II compares work given to us by God as part of our dignity created in the Imago Dei with toil, the difficulty of work on the human person. How much of a personal understanding of work is subjective? What is one's personal toil? What is one's personal toil in another person's dignified work using God's gift for the greater good? Should we try that again?
I think, well, I'm not sure exactly that I understand the full force of the last portion, but I think I get a general sense. Would you mind reading it one more time?
Sure. Pope John Paul II compares work given to us by God as part of our dignity created in the Imago Dei with toil, compares work with toil,
Yeah.
the difficulty of work on the human person.
Yeah.
How much of a personal understanding of work is subjective? What is one person's toil is another person's dignified work using God's gift for the greater good.
Yeah.
Maybe I read it better.
That's a very interesting question, a very important one. I do believe that that the work is, and I think those are also the words of John Paul II, arduous good. It's a hard good that requires hard work very often. And that can be a subjective experience. But I think the subjectivity of it often lies in how we construe the purpose and how we construe our relation to the purpose of the work. So that in some circumstances, if the work was chosen, imagine you really love someone. Even hard work is not hard work. Even hard work is something that you realize it's hard work, but you embrace it with willingness because of great love that you have for that person. And I think that this qualifying of our work by our attitude toward the world, toward others, toward activity itself is also very important, very fundamental. You cannot redeem work by simply changing the mechanics of work. You have to change and adjust your attitude toward work and toward that which you are seeking to achieve and the purpose that you are trying to realize. And in that sense, it can happen that the same thing might look for one person as total toil, and it's not a good at all. It's simply toil. And for another person, it's a difficult work, but they do it, and they do it willingly. We know it in many cases. Athletes place themselves under I don't know what conditions in order to achieve certain things. That's very arduous work, and nonetheless they affirm it with the fullness of their being. And that's also part of the reason why we need to situate work within the proper purposes of our lives. And then we discover that work can be very hard, and just for that being rewarding and deeply satisfying, and having a dignity. None of the dignities taken away. To the contrary, the arduousness increases the dignity of work then.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one last question that's related to the previous, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to maybe make a closing comment, particularly perhaps to our students. We're in the pandemic. I know that you have a lot of interest in small scale business, where again, I think the possibilities of humanized work are maybe greater than they are in these huge institutions. those have been very vulnerable. Those are the businesses that are closing in the pandemic. They're not surviving, they're not thriving. We know that work is often a context where there's no safety net or there's no second chance, and people fail, and it happens regularly. And I wonder what within the context of your thinking about peace and joy, how do you understand this human failure, both individually and corporately, particularly when we're failed by others or we fall down ourselves? But how do you think about failure in work as an inevitability for us all, perhaps, and something that can be redeemed, as you say, through your understanding of flourishing life?
Yeah, I think we will inevitably fail in one way or the other, and even in many successes. There may be a success in a particular stream of activity, but if you look at the life more generally, that just these successes might have been fed by all sorts of failures in life. There can be failure of marriage, there can be failure of all other sorts. And that's another reason why we have to look at work in the context of life as a whole. But even if one looks at the work itself, I think we can also lead the kind of life that can prepare us for failure, that can make us resilient in failure. I think we can also build communities, and as a society, we can build community that can sustain us when we trying the best that we can, we have failed. We can build social networks as well that will take care of us when we have failed, rather than assuming that any failure is simply the fault of a person who has failed. They just haven't done enough, and that's on them because the fact that they have failed. I think we can do better in order to sustain each other in failure. And often I think also a question of failure is not just a monetary economic question. It's also a reputational question. It's a self-doubt question, a self-image kind of a question. How much of our self is dependent on competitive advantage that we have over somebody else, or how much of our self-image is actually rooted very deeply in our very, very humanity, the fact that we have dignity whether we work or not, whether we succeed or whether we fail, and none of our failures take any of our dignity away. That kind of sense also, I think, is what Christian faith and its affirmation of the image of God gives us. And it's an important resource, I think, in our lives as a whole.
So we understand from polling that most people will go to college in the hope of getting a good job. Thoughts on that for our students as we conclude this great conversation?
Well, I think that's a noble and very important goal, especially if one understands the good job as in a kind of richer sense than simply measured by the how big the check is at the end of the month. But I think it's very important for us to take resources, to learn, and in order to have resources, just in order to be able to serve better, to enjoy our work better, but to serve better also others. But I would urge every student not to neglect success as a human being, to try to reflect on that. As one aims and strives to succeed in varieties of endeavors. Many students experience themselves, parents have been pushing them from when they were very small, just study, do this or do that, without kind of providing resources. That's what I hear at Yale, without providing resources to think about what's the meaning of all of this. and then they come to college, and maybe they had a strong self-image of themselves as successful in varieties of high schools where they were. Suddenly there's a different group of people, there's a lot of smart people, and you come into the classroom and there's always somebody sitting next to you who is smarter than you are, and then you fall into a depression, right? Because you constantly have to compare yourself. And when I talk to students about that, I said, this is not just a matter for students. This is what each professor experiences as well. Every time I go and sit in with a group of professors, I always think, oh, they've read so many books that I haven't read. I don't know this, I don't know that. And then I start comparing myself with them. I end up looking not so very good because I haven't done this or I haven't done that. A kind of sense that we don't need to achieve ourselves, that we are accepted. And then out of this sense of acceptance and grace, putting our efforts and releasing the powers of study, of service, of work, so that we can live joyful lives, lives that abound in benevolence and beneficence, of love toward others, and that create conditions in which these communities of ours, and the entire planet can thrive like a verdant tree.
Thank you so much. Thank you. On behalf of the entire Concordia community, thank you, Miroslav Wolf, for the most engaging and illuminating conversation about work and meaning. It's been grand. We affirm and applaud your commitment to a world in which every person can wrestle with life's most important questions and take a hold of a life worthy of our humanity. We are honored by being enriched by this work this evening. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to many for assistance with our program tonight. Carol Hedberg, Anna Benson, Todd Walworth, Wade Iverson, Susan Larson, Eric Eliason, Chris Mason, Cindy Carver, George Cannell, Terry Brandt, Christina Johnson Denier, Sarah Baumgarten, Larry Pappenfuss, Eric Johnson, Amy Kelly, and Steph Offeld. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight and for your fine questions. Good night from the Lorentzsen Center for Faith and Work at Concordia College. Stay safe, and wishing you good work now and in the future, graced with respect, engagement, and meaning. Good night.